The men who laugh first are usually the last to understand who they are laughing at. The transport bus rolled through the final security gate just after sunrise, its engine humming steadily as Blackstone Prison emerged from the morning haze. Surrounded by concrete walls, steel fencing, and watchtowers, the facility looked exactly like every story people imagined when they thought about prison. Inside the bus, most of the new arrivals stared out the windows in silence. Some looked nervous. Others looked exhausted. One man appeared completely at peace. Marcus Reed sat near the back with a small stack of books resting on his lap. At 63 years old, he was older than nearly everyone else on the bus. His dark skin showed the marks of age, and silver strands mixed through his closely cut hair. While several inmates shifted restlessly in their seats, Marcus remained calm, occasionally glancing down at the worn paperback resting on top of the stack. When the bus finally stopped, correctional officers began directing everyone toward intake processing. The line moved slowly. Names were called. Documents were checked. Instructions echoed through the building. Marcus followed every step without complaint. He listened carefully, nodded politely, and moved forward whenever directed. Several younger inmates noticed him immediately. In a place where confidence often mattered, an older man carrying books instead of attitude attracted attention. A few exchanged amused looks. Marcus either did not notice or simply chose not to react. Hours later, after processing was complete, Marcus entered Housing Unit C. The dayroom buzzed with activity. Television screens flickered. Conversations overlapped. Card games occupied several tables. The moment the new arrivals stepped through the door, dozens of eyes turned toward them. That was normal. New people always attracted attention. At a table near the center of the room sat Travis Cole. At 41 years old, Travis had established himself as the most influential inmate in the housing unit. Tall, confident, and surrounded by a small circle of loyal followers, he spent most days observing everything that happened around him. Very little escaped his attention. As the new arrivals entered, Travis leaned back in his chair and studied each face. Then he noticed Marcus, an older black inmate carrying books. Calm posture. No visible concern. No attempt to impress anyone. Travis smirked. "Look at that," he said quietly. Several men at the table followed his gaze. One laughed. Another shook his head. To them, Marcus looked completely out of place. Not dangerous. Not intimidating. Just an elderly man who seemed more interested in reading than surviving prison life. Across the room, Marcus located an empty chair near a large window and sat down. He placed his books neatly on the table before opening one. The noise around him continued. Conversations rose and fell. Chairs scraped across the floor. Yet Marcus appeared unaffected by any of it. Daniel Brooks, an inmate serving as a library assistant, happened to notice the scene. Something about Marcus stood out. Not because he looked powerful. Quite the opposite. He looked comfortable. The distinction was subtle but important. Most new arrivals spent their first day scanning the room, trying to identify threats and alliances. Marcus simply opened a book and began reading. 20 minutes later, Travis finally stood and crossed the room with two friends following behind him. Several nearby inmates immediately paid attention. Whenever Travis approached someone, people usually watched. He stopped beside Marcus's table and glanced at the stack of books. "You planning to open a bookstore?" A few people nearby chuckled. Marcus looked up calmly. "I do not think there is enough shelf space." The answer surprised several listeners. Travis smiled slightly. "You think you are funny?" Marcus closed his book carefully. "Not particularly." The response generated a few more laughs, though this time they were directed less at Marcus and more at the unexpected conversation. Travis studied him for a moment. Most people reacted differently when he approached. Marcus showed no fear, no hostility, and no desire to impress anyone. It was strange. "You new here?" Travis asked. "Today is my first day," Marcus replied. Travis nodded slowly. "Well, welcome to Blackstone." Marcus smiled politely. "Thank you." For reasons he could not explain, Travis walked away feeling slightly annoyed. The interaction had not gone the way he expected. Back at his table, he glanced toward the window. Marcus had already returned to reading. Daniel noticed the exchange from across the room and found himself wondering the same thing several others were beginning to wonder. Who exactly was Marcus Reed? And why did he seem completely comfortable in a place where everyone else struggled to find their footing? The second morning at Blackstone Prison began long before sunrise. Lights switched on throughout Housing Unit C, and the familiar sounds of prison life immediately followed. Doors opened. Voices echoed through the corridors. Inmates prepared for breakfast while correctional officers moved through the unit conducting routine counts. Marcus Reed sat quietly on the edge of his bunk, already awake. While many people struggled with the adjustment to prison life, Marcus appeared as composed as he had been the day before. After count cleared, he picked up one of his books and read for several minutes before joining the line for breakfast. Across the housing unit, Travis Cole noticed him immediately. Something about the older man continued bothering him. It was not fearlessness. Travis had seen fearless inmates before. It was not confidence either. Plenty of people carried confidence in a prison. Marcus possessed something different. He seemed completely comfortable with himself. In Travis's experience, that was rare. Most people wanted something. Respect, attention, protection, influence. Marcus seemed interested only in reading his books and following his routine. By breakfast, Travis had already decided he wanted to learn more. The dining hall buzzed with conversation as inmates filled tables across the room. Marcus selected a seat near the corner and began eating quietly. Several minutes later, Travis and two of his friends approached carrying trays. Without asking, they sat directly across from him. Marcus glanced up briefly before returning his attention to breakfast. One of Travis's friends looked at the book tucked beneath Marcus's arm. "You planning to read your way through prison?" A few nearby inmates laughed. Marcus smiled slightly. "It gives me something productive to do." Travis leaned back in his chair. "You know where you are, right?" Marcus nodded. "Blackstone Prison." More laughter followed. Travis shook his head. "That is not what I mean." Marcus took a sip of coffee. "I figured." The answer generated another round of amusement from surrounding tables. Travis was beginning to realize that every attempt to make Marcus uncomfortable somehow produced the opposite effect. Nothing seemed to bother him. Nothing seemed capable of disrupting his mood. After breakfast, the housing unit returned to its normal schedule. Some inmates reported to work assignments. Others attended educational programs. Marcus spent part of the morning in the library reviewing available books. Daniel Brooks happened to be working there when Marcus arrived. As library assistant, Daniel spent most of his time organizing materials and helping inmates locate resources. He watched as Marcus examined several shelves before selecting a handful of books covering history, leadership, and philosophy. Daniel found the choices interesting. Most inmates searched for entertainment. Marcus appeared to be studying. "Looking for something specific?" Daniel asked. Marcus smiled. "Just trying to learn something new." Daniel nodded. The answer sounded sincere. Throughout the afternoon, Marcus continued following a simple routine. He attended orientation meetings, completed paperwork, and familiarized himself with prison procedures. Yet no matter where he went, people seemed to notice him. Part of the attention came from Travis. The gang leader had a habit of directing attention toward anyone he found interesting. By evening, half the housing unit knew about the older black inmate, who carried books everywhere. Back in the day room, Marcus returned to his favorite spot near the large window. Sunlight filtered through the glass as he opened another book and began reading. Travis watched from across the room. Eventually, curiosity overcame him again. He stood and crossed the floor. Several nearby inmates immediately looked up, anticipating another exchange. Travis stopped beside the table and glanced at the book cover. "You always reading?" Marcus looked up. "Not always." "What do you do when you are not reading?" Marcus considered the question. "Usually I pay attention." Travis frowned slightly. "Pay attention to what?" Marcus closed the book and looked around the room. "People." For a brief moment, the answer caught Travis off guard. Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was something unusual about the response. It sounded less like a joke and more like a simple observation. Before Travis could think of another reply, Marcus reopened the book and continued reading. The conversation was over. Back at his table, Travis found himself oddly frustrated. He had expected an easy target. Instead, every interaction left him with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Daniel watched everything from a distance. The longer he observed Marcus read, the more convinced he became that the older man was hiding something. Not because Marcus acted suspiciously. Quite the opposite. It was because nothing about his behavior matched the environment around him. And as the evening count approached, Daniel began wondering whether the quiet newcomer understood far more about the people inside Blackstone than anyone realized. 3 days after arriving at Blackstone Prison, Marcus Reed had already become one of the most discussed people in Housing Unit C. The strange part was that he had done almost nothing to attract attention. He did not challenge anyone. He did not tell stories about himself. He did not try to build influence. Yet conversations about him continued spreading through the housing unit. Some inmates thought he was unusually confident. Others believed he was simply unaware of how prison culture worked. A few suspected something entirely different. Marcus seemed to understand things before they happened. On Wednesday morning, the housing unit gathered for breakfast as usual. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Men talked about sports, upcoming programs, and rumors moving through the facility. Marcus sat alone at the same table he preferred every morning. A paperback rested beside his tray. Across the room, Travis Cole watched him while drinking coffee. The older man had become impossible to ignore. Every attempt to make him uncomfortable seemed to fail. More frustratingly, Marcus never appeared to be trying. Daniel Brooks noticed the same thing. As library assistant, he interacted with dozens of inmates every week. Most people revealed their personalities quickly. Marcus remained difficult to figure out. During lunch, Daniel finally found an opportunity to speak with him. Marcus had stopped by the library looking for another book. Daniel helped him search several shelves before locating what he wanted. "You read a lot," Daniel said. Marcus smiled. "I always have." Daniel nodded. "Most people use books to escape prison." Marcus looked at the cover in his hands. "Books can help with that. Is that why you read?" Daniel asked. Marcus shook his head. "I read because there is always something new to learn." The answer sounded simple, yet Daniel found himself thinking about it long after Marcus left. Later that afternoon, an unusual situation developed in the recreation yard. Several inmates had gathered near a basketball court discussing a disagreement involving access to exercise equipment. Voices became increasingly frustrated. Nothing serious had happened, but the tension was obvious. Nearby inmates began paying attention. Travis stood with several friends watching from a distance. Daniel happened to be walking across the yard when he noticed Marcus sitting alone on a bench reading. The older man glanced toward the disagreement only briefly before returning to his book. A few minutes later, one of the inmates involved in the argument approached the bench. Daniel could not hear the entire conversation, but he watched as the younger inmate spoke rapidly while Marcus listened. Marcus responded with only a few calm sentences. The younger inmate looked confused at first, then thoughtful. Finally, he nodded and walked away. 10 minutes later, the disagreement near the basketball court had disappeared. Everyone returned to their normal activities. Daniel frowned. The timing seemed strange. That evening, curiosity finally overcame him. He approached the younger inmate and asked what Marcus had said. The man laughed. "Honestly, not much." "Then what happened?" Daniel asked. "He asked one question." Daniel waited. "What question?" The inmate shrugged. "He asked whether I wanted to solve the problem or win the argument." Daniel stared at him. "That was it. That was it." The younger inmate smiled. "Made me realize I was focused on the wrong thing." By dinner, the story had spread throughout the housing unit. Several inmates repeated the conversation. Others added details that probably never happened. As usual, the rumors grew larger with every retelling. Marcus seemed completely unaware. He spent the evening reading near the window while sunlight faded beyond the prison yard. Travis watched him from across the room. Something about the story bothered him. Not because it was impressive, because it sounded familiar. Marcus had a strange ability to make complicated situations appear simple. The same thing happened during every conversation. The same thing happened whenever people challenged him. It was as if he saw something others missed. Near lights out, Travis crossed the room once again. Several nearby inmates immediately noticed. Marcus looked up from his book as Travis approached the table. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Travis asked a question nobody expected. "How do you always know what to say?" Marcus studied him quietly before answering. "Most people already know the answer." Travis frowned. "Then why do they ask you?" Marcus closed the book gently. A faint smile crossed his face. "Sometimes people just need someone to help them see it." As Travis walked away, he felt the same frustration he had experienced since Marcus arrived. Except now another feeling had joined it. Curiosity. And for the first time, Travis began wondering whether the quiet old man knew far more than he was willing to reveal. By the end of Marcus Reed's first week at Blackstone Prison, people had stopped viewing him as merely an unusual newcomer. Nobody knew exactly what to make of him, but curiosity continued growing. Every day seemed to produce another small moment that challenged expectations. Marcus never raised his voice. He never tried to impress anyone. Yet people kept leaving conversations with him looking calmer than when they arrived. On Thursday afternoon, Housing Unit C settled into its normal routine after lunch. Some inmates watched television. Others played cards or discussed sports. Marcus sat near the window with a notebook resting beside one of his books. The sight immediately attracted attention from a few nearby inmates. Most people rarely saw someone writing notes for personal study inside the housing unit. Marcus appeared completely absorbed in what he was doing. Across the room, Travis Cole noticed him as well. The gang leader had spent the past several days trying to understand why the older man bothered him so much. Marcus was not competing for influence. He was not challenging anyone's authority. Yet somehow he remained at the center of attention. Travis disliked mysteries, and Marcus Reed was becoming one. Daniel Brooks happened to be organizing books near the library cart when a younger inmate named Eric approached Marcus's table. Eric had arrived at Blackstone several months earlier and struggled constantly with frustration. He often reacted emotionally to setbacks and frequently found himself involved in unnecessary disputes. Daniel recognized him immediately. Several nearby inmates glanced over, expecting another tense conversation. Instead, Eric simply sat down. Marcus closed his notebook and listened. For several minutes, Eric talked while Marcus remained silent. The younger inmate appeared upset about an educational program application that had been denied. He described the situation in detail, explaining how unfair the process felt. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Eric finally finished, Marcus asked only one question. "What are you going to do now?" Eric looked confused. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled. "You can spend the next month thinking about what happened, or you can spend the next month improving your next application." Eric stared at the table. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he laughed quietly. "I guess I already know which option makes more sense." Marcus nodded. "Most people do." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Eric thanked him and walked away looking noticeably different from when he arrived. Daniel watched the entire exchange. Once again, Marcus had solved a problem without giving instructions or making a speech. Somehow, he always seemed to guide people toward their own conclusions. Later that evening, another unusual moment occurred during recreation. Several inmates gathered near the indoor track discussing future plans after release. The conversation shifted toward employment, education, and personal goals. Most people spoke casually, but one inmate eventually admitted he had no idea what direction his life should take. The discussion stalled. Nobody seemed to have an answer. Marcus happened to be walking nearby. Someone jokingly called out to him, "Hey Marcus, got any wisdom for this one?" A few people laughed. Marcus stopped walking and thought for a moment. "Imagine you had 5 years left to live," he said. The group immediately became quiet. "What would you spend those years doing?" Several inmates exchanged uncertain looks. Marcus continued, "Now imagine you had 50 years left. If the answer changes completely, you are probably chasing the wrong goal." Nobody responded right away. Even Travis, listening from a distance, found himself thinking about the question. Marcus resumed walking as though nothing significant had happened. Yet the conversation he left behind continued for nearly an hour. Later that night, Travis sat alone in the day room watching Marcus read near the window. Something was becoming increasingly obvious. The older man possessed a level of self-control and awareness that seemed completely out of place inside Blackstone. More importantly, people were starting to notice. Travis did not like losing influence over the atmosphere of the housing unit. And for the first time since Marcus arrived, he began considering a possibility he had previously dismissed. Maybe the quiet old man was not as ordinary as he appeared. The question was becoming impossible to ignore. What kind of life had Marcus Reed lived before coming to Blackstone Prison? And why did it feel like everyone was only seeing a tiny fraction of the truth? The following week brought a subtle but important shift inside Housing Unit C. Marcus Reed was no longer simply the older inmate who spent his days reading books near the window. People had begun paying attention to details they initially overlooked. The more they observed him, the more questions emerged. Daniel Brooks noticed it first during morning recreation. While most inmates moved through their routines with familiar habits, Marcus seemed unusually aware of everything happening around him. He noticed small changes in people's moods. He noticed when someone seemed frustrated before they said a word. He noticed patterns that others ignored completely. Daniel found himself studying the older man more carefully with each passing day. One afternoon, he happened to witness something unusual in the prison library. A heavy cart loaded with books needed to be moved across the room. Several inmates struggled to position it correctly because one will kept catching on a damaged section of flooring. Before anyone could ask for help, Marcus walked over. He examined the cart for only a few seconds, adjusted its angle slightly, and suggested a different path across the room. The cart moved smoothly. The solution looked obvious afterward, but nobody else had seen it beforehand. Daniel stared at him. "How did you figure that out so fast?" Marcus smiled. "Most problems tell you how to solve them if you pay attention long enough." Daniel laughed. "You have an answer for everything." Marcus shook his head. "Not everything. Just a few things." The conversation stayed with Daniel for the rest of the day. Later that evening, another strange observation added to the growing mystery. Several inmates gathered in the recreation area, discussing exercise routines. One man complained about poor posture causing discomfort during workouts. Marcus happened to be passing by. Without making a scene, he suggested a small adjustment to the man's stance and breathing pattern. The inmate tried it and immediately noticed a difference. The reaction attracted attention. Questions followed. Marcus answered politely, but briefly before continuing on his way. Travis Cole watched the entire exchange from across the room. The gang leader had spent days trying to understand why people increasingly gravitated toward Marcus. It was not charisma. Marcus rarely spoke unless someone approached him first. It was not authority. He never tried to control conversations. Yet people consistently left interactions with him feeling better informed than before. That fact bothered Travis more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Daniel found Marcus sitting alone in the yard shortly after breakfast. A cool breeze moved across the recreation area, while most inmates talked in small groups. Marcus sat quietly, eyes closed, breathing slowly and steadily. Daniel stopped nearby. Something about the scene caught his attention. Marcus appeared completely relaxed despite the noise around him. After a few moments, Marcus opened his eyes and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." Daniel blinked. "How did you know I was standing there?" Marcus pointed toward the ground. "Your footsteps changed when you slowed down." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. Marcus chuckled softly and returned his attention to the yard. The explanation sounded simple, yet it raised even more questions. Throughout the rest of the week, similar moments continued appearing. Marcus noticed things before other people did. He anticipated problems. He offered practical advice. He carried himself with a level of balance and awareness that seemed unusual for someone his age. Rumors began spreading quietly through Housing Unit C. Some inmates believed Marcus had worked as a teacher. Others thought he might have been military. A few suspected he had some kind of advanced professional background. Nobody knew the truth. Meanwhile, Travis found himself becoming increasingly curious. The more he watched Marcus, the less sense the older man made. One evening, after observing Marcus help another inmate improve his posture during a study session, Travis leaned toward one of his friends. "You notice how he moves?" His friend shrugged. "Moves how?" Travis kept watching, like he always knows exactly where everything is. The friend looked over and frowned. "Maybe you are overthinking it." Travis did not answer. For the first time since Marcus arrived at Blackstone, he was beginning to suspect that the quiet old man was hiding far more than anyone realized. And somewhere beneath the growing rumors, a possibility was beginning to form. What if Marcus Reed had spent years learning skills that nobody inside Blackstone knew anything about? The mystery surrounding Marcus Reed continued growing during his second week at Blackstone Prison. What began as curiosity had slowly evolved into something closer to fascination. People still could not explain why the older man attracted so much attention, but they found themselves watching him anyway. Every day seemed to reveal another detail that did not quite fit the image of an ordinary inmate. On Monday afternoon, Housing Unit C became unusually crowded after several programs released participants at the same time. The day room filled with conversations, moving chairs, and the constant background noise that defined prison life. Marcus sat near the window as usual, reading quietly while the room moved around him. Travis Cole observed from across the floor. Over the previous week, he had begun paying closer attention to Marcus than he cared to admit. The more he watched, the more unusual things seemed to appear. None of them were dramatic. None of them proved anything. Yet together they created a picture that made less sense every day. Daniel Brooks noticed it too. While organizing books on a rolling cart, he watched Marcus interact with several inmates who approached him throughout the afternoon. One wanted advice about an educational class. Another wanted help understanding a complicated form. A third simply wanted someone to listen. Marcus treated each person exactly the same. He listened carefully, asked a few questions, and offered simple observations. Somehow people always walked away looking more confident than before. Later that day, a small incident drew even more attention. During recreation, several inmates were discussing exercise routines and physical conditioning. One younger inmate complained about constantly feeling off balance during certain movements. The conversation was casual, but Marcus happened to overhear it while passing by. Without drawing attention to himself, he suggested a slight adjustment in posture and foot placement. The inmate tried it immediately and looked surprised. "That feels different," he admitted. Marcus nodded. Efficiency usually does. The comment might have been forgotten if not for what happened next. Another inmate asked a follow-up question. Then another. Within minutes, a small group had formed around Marcus. The discussion remained respectful and calm, but Daniel could not help noticing something strange. Marcus answered every question quickly, yet never sounded like he was showing off. He spoke the way experienced teachers often spoke, focusing on helping rather than impressing. Travis noticed the same thing. By evening, the scene continued replaying in his mind. He had spent years around athletes, military veterans, and people from all kinds of backgrounds. Marcus reminded him of someone, but he could not identify who. There was a discipline in the way the older man moved, a precision in the way he observed people. Most importantly, there was an absence of ego. That combination felt unusual. The next morning brought another clue. During breakfast, an inmate accidentally dropped a tray near one of the serving stations. Before the tray even hit the floor, Marcus had already shifted slightly to avoid its path. The movement was small and natural. Most people never noticed. Travis did. So did Daniel. Neither said anything. Yet both found themselves thinking about it afterward. The reaction had been incredibly fast, almost automatic. Later that afternoon, Daniel finally decided to ask a direct question. He found Marcus in the library reviewing a book on leadership and decision-making. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Marcus smiled. "You just did." Daniel laughed. "Fair enough. Here is the second question. What did you do before coming here?" Marcus closed the book gently. For a moment, he seemed to consider the answer. "A lot of different things." Daniel shook his head. "That is not really an answer." Marcus smiled again. "Sometimes the short version is all people need." Daniel wanted to push further, but decided against it. Something told him Marcus would reveal information only when he chose to. As evening count approached, Travis stood near the dayroom entrance watching Marcus read beside the window. More than ever, he felt certain that the older man was hiding an extraordinary past. The question was no longer whether Marcus possessed unusual skills. The question was where he had learned them. And somewhere beyond the walls of Blackstone Prison, the answer was already beginning to move closer. The following days brought an unexpected development inside Blackstone Prison. Rumors about Marcus Reed had evolved beyond simple curiosity. At first, people merely wondered why he seemed different. Now they were actively trying to understand who he had been before arriving at the facility. The problem was that every attempt to learn more produced almost nothing. Marcus answered questions politely, but rarely discussed himself. If someone asked about his past, he usually redirected the conversation toward the future. If someone asked about accomplishments, he spoke about lessons instead. The result only deepened the mystery. On Friday afternoon, a new inmate named Raymond arrived in Housing Unit C. Unlike most newcomers, Raymond had previously served time at several correctional facilities across the country. Within hours, he had begun introducing himself and learning names. During evening recreation, he noticed Marcus reading near the familiar window. After studying him for several seconds, Raymond frowned slightly. There was something familiar about the older man. He could not immediately place it. Later that night, while speaking with a group of inmates, Raymond heard Marcus's name mentioned. Several people described the older man as unusually wise, calm, and observant. Others talked about his strange ability to notice details before anyone else. Raymond listened carefully. Then he asked a question that instantly attracted attention. Does he ever talk about where he learned all that? The answer was unanimous. No. Raymond glanced across the room, toward Marcus. The expression on his face suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle. The next morning, Daniel Brooks found Raymond sitting alone in the dining hall. "You seem interested in Marcus," Daniel said. Raymond nodded slowly. "Maybe." Daniel smiled. "You know something?" Raymond leaned back in his chair. "Not exactly. I just have a feeling I have seen someone like him before." Daniel waited for more, but Raymond merely shook his head. "I cannot explain it yet." Throughout the weekend, Marcus continued his normal routine. He visited the library, attended educational programs, exercised during recreation periods, and spent evenings reading. Yet small observations continued accumulating. During one recreation session, an inmate accidentally dropped a set of papers as a strong breeze moved through the yard. Before anyone reacted, Marcus had already stepped into the exact position needed to catch several pages before they scattered. The movement appeared effortless. Another time, Marcus correctly predicted that a scheduled activity would be delayed because of a staffing issue. 30 minutes later, the announcement arrived. Nobody understood how he knew. Daniel increasingly suspected that Marcus possessed years of specialized training in something. The question remained what kind. Meanwhile, Travis Cole found himself watching Marcus more than ever. What started as amusement had become genuine curiosity. One evening, Travis sat with several friends discussing the older inmate. "Something is different about him," Travis admitted. One friend laughed. "Everybody says that." Travis shook his head. "No, I mean really different." "Like what?" Travis paused. "Have you ever noticed how he never wastes movement?" The others exchanged confused looks. Travis continued. "Watch him long enough. Everything he does seems intentional." The comment lingered in the air. None of them had a clear explanation. Later that night, Raymond approached Marcus directly. The housing unit had quieted after count, and only a handful of inmates remained in the day room. Marcus looked up from his book as Raymond sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Raymond smiled. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "Of course." Raymond studied him carefully. "Did you ever teach for a living?" A faint expression crossed Marcus's face. Not surprise. More like recognition. "Why do you ask?" Raymond leaned forward slightly. "Because I have met a lot of teachers. You remind me of the best ones." Marcus smiled warmly. "That is a generous compliment." Raymond returned the smile, but noticed something important. Marcus had not answered the question. As Marcus reopened his book, Raymond sat back in his chair, more convinced than ever that the older man was hiding an extraordinary chapter of his life. And somewhere beyond the walls of Blackstone Prison, pieces of that hidden story were slowly moving closer to being revealed. By the third week, Marcus Reed had become the most talked-about mystery in Blackstone Prison. What made the situation unusual was that Marcus never tried to attract attention. In fact, he often seemed uncomfortable whenever conversations focused on him. Yet the rumors continued spreading. Every day produced another story. Someone claimed Marcus could read people's intentions before they spoke. Someone else insisted he had once worked as a professor. Others believed he had military experience. None of the theories matched perfectly, but nobody could explain the growing collection of strange observations surrounding him. On Tuesday morning, Daniel Brooks arrived at the library earlier than usual. As he organized returned books, he noticed Raymond standing nearby with an expression suggesting deep concentration. "You are thinking about Marcus again," Daniel said. Raymond laughed. "Is it that obvious?" Daniel nodded. "You have looked like that for 3 days." Raymond glanced around before lowering his voice slightly. "I think I finally remembered where I have seen someone like him." Daniel immediately became interested. "Where?" Raymond leaned against a bookshelf. "Years ago, before prison, I worked security at a convention center in Las Vegas." Daniel waited. "And?" "There was an international event there. Leadership seminars, personal development speakers, professional trainers." Raymond paused. One of the instructors moved exactly like Marcus. Daniel frowned. "You think it was him?" Raymond shook his head. "I do not know, but the way he observed people was almost identical." The conversation ended without answers, but the idea spread quickly. By lunch, several inmates had heard a modified version of the story. By dinner, the details had already changed. Some claimed Marcus had been a famous speaker. Others insisted he had trained executives. The rumors became increasingly dramatic with each retelling. Meanwhile, Marcus remained completely unaware of most of the speculation. He spent the afternoon reading near the window, occasionally making notes in a notebook that nobody had ever seen him explain. Across the room, Travis Cole watched everything unfold. The gang leader had stopped making jokes about Marcus days earlier. Curiosity had replaced amusement. What frustrated him most was the lack of information. Every clue seemed to raise even more questions. That evening brought another unexpected development. A new correctional officer assigned temporarily to Housing Unit C entered the dayroom during recreation. He was older than most staff members and appeared to be in his late 50s. As he walked through the room conducting routine observations, his eyes briefly landed on Marcus. The officer stopped walking. For a moment, he simply stared. Marcus looked up from his book and offered a polite nod. The officer nodded back before continuing his duties. Most people ignored the interaction. Daniel did not. Neither did Travis. Something about the brief exchange felt different. Later that evening, Daniel happened to encounter the officer near the library entrance. Acting casually, he asked a simple question. "Everything going okay today?" The officer nodded. "Just another shift." Daniel hesitated. "You seemed surprised when you saw Marcus read." The officer looked at him for several seconds before smiling faintly. "Interesting man. You know him?" Daniel asked. The officer considered the question carefully. "Let us just say I have heard of people like him before." Before Daniel could ask anything else, the officer continued down the hallway. The answer created far more questions than it resolved. By lights out, the entire housing unit seemed filled with theories. Some inmates dismissed the rumors completely. Others became increasingly convinced that Marcus had lived an extraordinary life before arriving at Blackstone. Travis sat alone for several minutes thinking about everything he had observed over the past few weeks. Marcus never sought respect, yet people gave it to him. Marcus never tried to influence anyone, yet his influence continued growing. Most importantly, Marcus never corrected the rumors. He simply ignored them. As the housing unit settled into silence for the night, Travis found himself staring toward Marcus's bunk. For the first time, he was no longer trying to figure out whether Marcus was hiding something. He was trying to understand how important that hidden story might actually be. And somewhere beyond the prison walls, a person connected to Marcus Reed was already making plans that would soon change everything. Monday morning arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation hanging over Housing Unit C. Nobody could explain exactly why. Perhaps it was the growing collection of rumors surrounding Marcus Reed. Perhaps it was the feeling that something important was approaching. Whatever the reason, conversations throughout the housing unit seemed unusually focused on one subject. Marcus, meanwhile, followed his routine exactly as always. He finished breakfast, spent part of the morning in the library, and later settled near the window with a book resting on his lap. To anyone observing casually, nothing had changed. Yet shortly after lunch, a correctional officer entered the housing unit carrying a clipboard and called out Marcus's name. Several heads immediately turned. Visitor appointments were not uncommon inside Blackstone, but Marcus had never received one before. Marcus calmly stood and closed his book. "Thank you," he said before following the officer toward the visitation area. The moment he disappeared through the door, speculation erupted throughout the housing unit. Travis Cole noticed it instantly. Men who rarely paid attention to anything beyond their own routines suddenly became interested. Daniel Brooks felt the same curiosity. Even Raymond appeared unusually focused. Nearly everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who would come to visit Marcus Reed? Nearly 40 minutes later, Marcus entered the visitation room. Seated on the opposite side of the glass was a well-dressed man in his early 50s wearing a navy suit and silver tie. The moment Marcus saw him, a genuine smile appeared on his face. It was rare. Very few people inside Blackstone had ever seen Marcus react that way. The visitor smiled as well. "It is good to see you again," he said. Marcus nodded warmly. "You too, Victor." The man's name was Victor Kane. For nearly an hour, they talked quietly through the visitation phones. They discussed books, mutual acquaintances, and current events. Their conversations sounded ordinary enough. Yet several staff members passing through the visitation area noticed something unusual. Victor treated Marcus with extraordinary respect. Not sympathy, not pity, respect. The kind often reserved for highly accomplished people. At one point, Victor laughed and shook his head. "You still have not changed." Marcus smiled. "Neither have you." Victor leaned back in his chair. "You know, people still talk about those years." Marcus looked away briefly. That was a long time ago. Maybe, Victor replied. But some things do not disappear. Before leaving, Victor handed several approved documents to prison staff for processing. Nothing about the exchange appeared remarkable. Yet one employee happened to glimpse part of the paperwork before filing it. A logo appeared at the top of one page. Later that afternoon, whispers began moving quietly through administrative offices. Back inside Housing Unit C, Marcus returned from visitation carrying the same calm expression he always wore. The questions began immediately. "Who was that?" one inmate asked. "Old friend," Marcus answered. Another inmate smiled. "Important friend?" Marcus chuckled softly. "Everyone is important to somebody." The answer only fueled more speculation. Daniel approached later in the evening. "So who exactly is Victor Kane?" Marcus looked up from his book. "Someone I have known for many years." Daniel laughed. "You really do not like giving direct answers." Marcus smiled. "Sometimes the simple answer is the direct answer." Across the room, Travis watched the conversation unfold. Something about the visitor bothered him. Not in a negative way. More like another piece of a puzzle finally appearing. The man had looked successful, confident, educated. More importantly, he had clearly respected Marcus. Deeply respected him. As lights out approached, another rumor began spreading through Housing Unit C. Nobody knew where it originated. Nobody could verify it. Yet by the end of the night, dozens of inmates had already heard some version of the story. According to the rumor, Victor Kane had once been a student of Marcus Reed. Not in school, not in prison, somewhere else. Somewhere far beyond Blackstone. The details remained unclear. But for the first time, the rumors were no longer asking whether Marcus had an extraordinary past. They were beginning to ask how many people outside these walls might already know exactly who he was. The morning after Victor Kane's visit, the atmosphere inside Housing Unit C felt noticeably different. The rumors that had once circulated quietly now moved openly through conversations across the dayroom, the recreation yard, and even the library. For weeks, people had speculated about Marcus Reed. Now they finally had something concrete to discuss. A successful visitor in a tailored suit had traveled a considerable distance to see him, and the respect displayed during that meeting had not gone unnoticed. Marcus, however, seemed completely unaffected by the attention. He followed the same routine as always. Breakfast, reading, exercise, study, reflection. It was almost as if the rumors belonged to someone else entirely. Daniel Brooks arrived at the library shortly after lunch and found Marcus reviewing a thick hardcover book on leadership. "You know, people are talking even more now," Daniel said. Marcus looked up and smiled. "People have always talked." Daniel laughed. "That is probably true." He hesitated before continuing. "Victor Kane is not an ordinary visitor, is he?" Marcus closed the book carefully. "Victor worked very hard to become the man he is today." Daniel noticed the answer again avoided the question. "Did you help him?" Marcus thought for a moment. "A long time ago, I shared some things that were useful to him." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds important." Marcus smiled. Sometimes small lessons become important years later. The conversation ended there, but Daniel could not stop thinking about it. Later that afternoon, another piece of information surfaced unexpectedly. A staff member accidentally left a newspaper clipping inside a stack of donated reading materials awaiting inspection. Most inmates ignored newspapers, but Daniel happened to notice a familiar name while sorting the pile. The article focused on a national leadership conference held several years earlier. One photograph showed Victor Kane standing beside a group of respected instructors and consultants. The image was small and grainy, yet Daniel froze when he noticed a face in the background. It looked remarkably similar to Marcus. Daniel stared for several seconds before checking the caption. Most names were listed. One was partially obscured by the fold of the page. All he could read was M. Reed. His heart immediately began racing. He did not show the clipping to anyone. Instead, he folded the page and spent the rest of the afternoon thinking. Meanwhile, Travis Cole was reaching conclusions of his own. For the first time since Marcus arrived, Travis stopped focusing on the mystery and started focusing on the reactions of others. Staff respected Marcus. Inmates respected Marcus. Visitors respected Marcus. Nobody treated him like an ordinary man. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. That evening, during recreation, Raymond approached Marcus once again. "I have a question," he said. Marcus smiled. "You usually do." Raymond laughed. "Fair point. He leaned forward slightly. Did you ever run some kind of training program? Marcus looked toward the window for a moment. Why do you ask? Raymond shrugged. Because every time you explain something, it sounds like you have taught thousands of people before. For the first time, Marcus did not immediately answer. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. Finally, he nodded slightly. I spent many years teaching. Raymond felt a surge of excitement. Teaching what? Marcus smiled gently. Different things to different people. Before Raymond could ask another question, the evening count announcement echoed through the housing unit. The conversation ended. Yet the single admission spread quickly after Raymond shared it with a few trusted friends. By lights out, dozens of inmates knew the same fact. Marcus Reed had spent years teaching. Nobody knew where. Nobody knew how many people. Nobody knew exactly what he taught. But for the first time, the mystery surrounding him had moved beyond speculation. A real piece of the truth had finally emerged. And outside the walls of Blackstone Prison, another visitor had already submitted paperwork for an upcoming visit. A visitor whose arrival would reveal far more about Marcus Reed than anyone inside Housing Unit C was prepared to hear. The next visitor arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, and from the moment the name appeared on the visitation schedule, several staff members seemed unusually interested. Marcus Reed, however, reacted exactly as he always did. He thanked the officer who informed him, closed the book he had been reading, and calmly walked toward the visitation area. Back inside Housing Unit C, the rumors immediately intensified. Daniel Brooks noticed it first. People were no longer simply curious about Marcus. They were actively waiting for answers. Even Travis Cole found himself watching the clock. When Marcus finally entered the visitation room, he was greeted by a woman in her 40s dressed in professional business attire. Unlike Victor Kane, she appeared visibly emotional upon seeing him. Her face brightened immediately. Marcus smiled warmly and nodded. Throughout the visit, they spoke for nearly an hour. Although nobody could hear the conversation, several staff members noticed something impossible to ignore. The visitor listened to Marcus with the same respect people usually reserve for highly accomplished experts. At one point she laughed, then shook her head as though recalling an old memory. Later she reached into a folder and showed Marcus several photographs. He studied them carefully before smiling. When the visit ended, the woman stood before leaving and placed her hand over her heart in a gesture of gratitude. Marcus responded with a respectful nod. The moment she departed, one of the administrative staff members happened to glance at the visitor registration information. The name seemed familiar. Several minutes later, curiosity led to a quick search through publicly available professional records. The discovery spread quietly through the administration building before eventually reaching parts of the prison staff. The visitor was the founder of a highly successful international training organization. More surprising than her success was a statement listed in an old interview archived online. She had once described a man named Marcus Reed as one of the most influential teachers in her life. By evening, fragments of the information began leaking into inmate conversations. Nobody knew the complete story, but the rumors were changing rapidly. The theories about Marcus being a teacher suddenly seemed far more believable. Daniel learned about the visitor through casual conversation with a staff member who trusted him. He spent the next several hours trying to process what he had heard. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. Marcus was not simply knowledgeable. He was not simply wise. Multiple successful people from outside prison walls appeared to know him personally and credit him for helping shape their lives. Later that evening, Daniel approached Marcus in the library. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Marcus smiled. "You usually do." Daniel laughed nervously. "Were you some kind of instructor?" For the first time, Marcus did not redirect the question. He sat quietly for several seconds before answering. "I spent many years teaching and training people." Daniel's eyes widened. "A lot of people." Marcus looked down at the book resting on the table. "More than I ever expected." The answer immediately confirmed what many had begun to suspect. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "Training them for what?" Marcus smiled softly. "For life, mostly." The response sounded simple, yet Daniel knew there was more beneath it. Across the housing unit, Travis continued watching everything unfold. For weeks, he had assumed Marcus was hiding an interesting past. Now he was beginning to realize the truth might be much larger than anyone imagined. Every new piece of information seemed to point in the same direction. Marcus had not been an ordinary teacher. He had influenced people who later became highly successful leaders themselves. As Lights Out approached, another rumor moved through Housing Unit C faster than any before it. According to several sources, Marcus Reed had once operated a respected academy that attracted students from around the world. Nobody knew exactly what he taught there. Nobody knew how famous it had become. But one thing was suddenly clear. The quiet black inmate reading books by the window was not merely a wise old man. He had once stood at the center of something far larger than anyone inside Blackstone Prison had ever imagined. The next morning, Marcus Reed woke up earlier than usual, the morning sunlight filtering through the small barred window and casting narrow stripes across his cell. He moved slowly, stretching his arms and feeling the stiffness from a lifetime of activity, both in and out of prison. Outside, the sound of the prison yard awakening was unmistakable. The footsteps, the doors clanging, and the distant shouts carried through the corridors. Daniel Brooks appeared at the cell door just as Marcus was finishing his morning routine. "Morning," Daniel said quietly, a hint of anticipation in his voice. Marcus nodded. "Morning," he replied, taking a deep breath and adjusting the simple gray uniform he wore. Today, something felt different. The air carried a sense of expectation, a subtle tension that Daniel could not quite place. They walked together toward the common area, passing other inmates who greeted Marcus with cautious nods. Unlike the previous months, there was a noticeable shift in how people regarded him. A low murmur of recognition seemed to ripple through the rooms they passed, an acknowledgement that Marcus was not just another man serving time. When they reached the library, Marcus paused and looked around, noting the positions of guards, the arrangement of tables, and the quiet corners where inmates often gathered to read or converse. He moved to a table near the center, a spot where he could observe the entire room. Daniel sat across from him, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You know," Daniel started, "people are talking. Some of the guys are wondering about your past, about what you actually did before coming here." Marcus smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Let them wonder," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a subtle weight of authority. The truth often speaks for itself when the time is right. Throughout the morning, Marcus quietly assisted a few inmates who approached him with questions about reading strategies, basic exercises to relieve stress, and advice on maintaining focus. His demeanor was patient, measured, and encouraging, yet there was an unmistakable air of command in how he carried himself. Daniel observed everything, noting how the other inmates began to pay more attention, the casual chatter pausing whenever Marcus offered a comment or a suggestion. Around mid-morning, the door to the library opened, and a staff member walked in, carrying a small envelope. The officer approached Marcus directly. "Mr. Reed, this just arrived for you," she said, handing him the envelope. Marcus took it, noticing the official seal. He opened it carefully, scanning the contents quickly but thoroughly. His expression remained neutral, though a slight tightening of his jaw indicated he was processing something significant. After reading, he looked up at Daniel and spoke in a low voice. "It seems I am to meet with the administration this afternoon. There are questions about my background, inquiries they were unable to verify previously." Daniel nodded, understanding that this was an important moment, potentially shifting the balance of respect and influence Marcus held within the facility. The rest of the morning passed in a focused, almost ritualistic manner, with Marcus completing small exercises and reviewing notes, ensuring he remained centered. By midday, whispers circulated quietly through the library, speculation about the envelope and what it contained. Even inmates not in the library seemed aware that something notable was unfolding. Marcus, however, remained composed, his presence alone commanding attention without a single word. As lunch approached, Daniel and Marcus prepared to move to the cafeteria, aware that the afternoon's meeting could change perceptions within Blackstone Prison dramatically. The slow, deliberate steps Marcus took down the corridor reflected his internal calm, an outward display of confidence earned through years of experience and mastery. Others watched from their cells and along the hallways, sensing the quiet authority that distinguished Marcus from the rest. By the time they reached the cafeteria, the atmosphere had shifted. Curiosity, respect, and cautious anticipation mingled in the air. Marcus Reed, the quiet black inmate with a storied past, was poised to reveal layers of his experience in a way that would resonate with both staff and inmates alike, confirming that his reputation extended far beyond the simple walls of his cell. The meeting with the administration turned out to be far less dramatic than the rumors suggested, yet its impact spread throughout Blackstone Prison almost immediately. By the following morning, Marcus Reed returned to his usual seat near the window with the same stack of books resting beside him. Nothing about his routine had changed. He still greeted people politely. He still listened more than he spoke. He still spent hours reading and helping anyone who sincerely asked for guidance. Yet the atmosphere around him felt completely different. The questions that had dominated conversations for weeks had finally found answers. Staff members had quietly confirmed portions of Marcus's background. Former students had visited. Professional records existed. The academy was real. The years of teaching were real. The influence was real. Marcus had spent decades training and mentoring people from around the world, including individuals who later became respected leaders, instructors, and professionals in their own fields. The revelation moved through Blackstone with remarkable speed. What surprised everyone most was Marcus's reaction. He did not celebrate. He did not correct people who exaggerated his accomplishments. He did not seem interested in his own reputation at all. In fact, whenever someone brought up his past, he usually redirected the conversation toward the future. Daniel Brooks noticed this pattern repeatedly. One afternoon, he finally asked why. Marcus closed his book and smiled. Because what I used to be cannot help anyone nearly as much as what they choose to become. Daniel sat quietly for a moment. Even after learning the truth, Marcus still found ways to simplify complicated ideas. Across the room, Travis Cole listened to the conversation. Over the previous weeks, his attitude had changed more than anyone else's. The man he once dismissed as an easy target had become the person he respected most inside Blackstone. The realization was not easy to accept at first. Travis had spent years judging people quickly. He believed he could understand someone within minutes of meeting them. Marcus had completely destroyed that assumption. Later that evening, Travis approached the familiar table by the window. Several nearby inmates noticed immediately. The two men had shared many conversations over the past few weeks, but this one felt different. Travis sat down across from Marcus and looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "I was wrong about you." Marcus smiled gently. "Most people are wrong about somebody." Travis shook his head. "No, I mean really wrong." Marcus waited. "When you first arrived, I thought I had you figured out." Travis laughed quietly. "Turns out I did not know anything." Marcus closed his book and leaned back slightly. "That happens to all of us." Travis nodded. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" Marcus asked. "Stay calm. Stay respectful. Even when people underestimate you." Marcus looked toward the large window where the final light of the day was fading beyond the prison yard. "Because other people's opinions are temporary. Character stays with you." The words settled over the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Eventually, Travis smiled and shook his head. "You always have an answer." Marcus laughed softly. "Only because I spent many years asking questions." In the weeks that followed, Blackstone Prison continued operating exactly as it always had. The schedules remained the same. The routines remained the same. Yet something inside Housing Unit C had undeniably changed. People listened more carefully. They judged more slowly. They treated one another with a little more respect than before. Marcus never claimed credit for any of it. He simply continued reading, teaching, and helping whenever the opportunity appeared. One evening, Daniel asked him whether he regretted anything about the life that had brought him to Blackstone. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Every life contains mistakes," he said. "The important thing is whether you learn from them." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Marcus smiled and reopened his book. Outside the window, the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside the housing unit, conversations continued, cards were played, televisions flickered, and life moved forward. Yet the lesson Marcus Reed left behind remained simple and unforgettable. Real strength does not announce itself. Real wisdom does not demand attention. And the most remarkable person in the room is often the one everyone overlooks at first.